I am going to pass this over to our esteemed presenter this evening, Lara Vapnek, who is coming to us from New York City and literally wrote the book on Elizabeth Gurley Flynn.
Oh, it's backwards. Okay.
No, it looks good on mine.
It
Don't
looks good
worry.
on yours. Oh, that's funny. On mine, it's like mirrored. Yeah, actually, I wrote the book long enough ago that I had to sit down and reread a couple of chapters to prepare for tonight. So that was interesting. I was like, oh, okay, this is an interesting story. But yeah, so thank you, Kaylee, for inviting me to speak, and thank you to everyone in the audience for attending. I know as the world opens up, there's like a dizzying array of ways that we can all spend our time. So thank you for being here this evening, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and just to discussion and answering whatever questions you might have. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was born in Concord, New Hampshire in 1890, and she died in Moscow in 1964. And Flynn I would say she spent more time on picket lines than she did in libraries, but she loved to read and she loved libraries. And that was one of the reasons when Kaylee invited me to give this talk, I just felt like, oh, wow, I have to do this. It just fits in well with her life. It tended to be when I was doing the research for my biography, I noticed that she read really intensively, basically at certain periods where she was sick or she couldn't leave the house for some reason. She was kind of always on the go. So it was really only during periods of enforced idleness that she read a lot. I mean, she was always reading the newspaper and stuff like that, but that she really read books. So the first period like that was when she was 14. She got this terrible tooth infection and she had to take a 6-month break from school. And at that point, she started plowing through classic books by people like Edward Bellamy, Henry Thoreau, and Henrik Ibsen. And she emerged from this period of intensive reading as a feminist and as a socialist. When she was 30, the stress of the Red Scare brought on a mental and physical breakdown. And as she convalesced in Oregon, she read classic books focusing on history, science, and the Bible. And at age 65, when she was imprisoned in Alderson Female Penitentiary for being a leader of the American Communist Party, she read her way through the prison library, enjoying fiction by Thomas Mann, Henry James, and Virginia Woolf. But one of the documents that she returned to the most over the course of her long life was the US Constitution, especially the First Amendment, which guaranteed freedom of speech. And so I'm just putting it up here just to refresh everyone's memory. And so this was an amendment a principle, not just an amendment, but a principle that she returned to again and again during the course of her life. And this was basically because she spent her life advocating for dissenting ideas. And so to figure out how she became such a dedicated radical, I think we need to start with her childhood. Flynn was born, as I mentioned, in Concord, New Hampshire in 1890 to a radical Irish American family. Her father, Tom Flynn, grew up in Maine, and he went to work in a granite quarry with his father and brothers when he was just 10 years old. And his family had migrated from Ireland. And this was just very typical, I think, when you look at working class biographies from the late 19th and early 20th century. Just child labor was so common. It's kind of remarkable. Having watched all of the men in his family die from lung disease, he decided that he needed to get an education. He enrolled in Dartmouth, and he wanted to become an engineer. But when his older brother died, he had to leave school to help support his mother and his sisters. He came from a large family. He acquired enough skill to become a map maker, but his work was unsteady. Flynn's mother, Annie Gurley, migrated to New England from Galway, Ireland, as a teenager. She was the oldest of 13 children, and she was a highly skilled seamstress, and she worked to support her family. She was also a feminist. She saved her earnings to go to hear lectures by two leading suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And she taught Elizabeth and her two sisters, Kathy and Bina, to be a self-reliant and self-supporting women. And this idea of independence was something that Flynn always said she got from her mother. When Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was 10, the family moved to the Bronx. And honestly, I wish, as I'm narrating all of this, I wish I had some more photographs of this earlier period in her life, but unfortunately I don't. The family moved to the Bronx, their first apartment, as she described it, as infested by mice, rats, cockroaches, and bed bugs. The family could barely afford heat, soap, or clothing. And on cold winter days, they would huddle in the kitchen and shut off the rest of the house. Elizabeth and her two younger sisters and brother did their homework by the light of a kerosene lamp when the gas was shut off for non-payment, as it often was, because her father had very unsteady work. Their only real entertainment was from reading. And every week they walked across the bridge near her house to borrow books from the public library on East 125th Street. So there's another library tie-in for you. In 1902, the family began attending meetings at the local socialist club. As Flynn later recalled, socialism was a great discovery, a hope, a purpose, a flame within me. Her father became something of a fanatic, dragging the family to long meetings in which her younger siblings fell asleep. Her mother often wished that her father would go out and get a job instead of sitting around the kitchen table and talking about socialist philosophy. Socialism has a lot of different definitions, and it has a long history in the United States, which I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A if you have questions about it. But basically, Flynn understood it as an alternative to capitalism in which productive property and natural resources would be owned collectively and managed to benefit the public good, rather than being owned by an individual or a corporation and managed to make a profit. Flynn spent most of her life trying, in her own words, to persuade the majority of the American people that socialism would be a happier, more secure, and peaceful, more just and equitable system of society than capitalism is or can be. And so in Flynn's lifetime, as in our own, this was, definitely a radical idea. So by the age of 16, Flynn began speaking on street corners around New York City. Her early speeches, and this is one of the reasons that I was able to write this book, was that her either Flynn or perhaps her mother kept a scrapbook where they saved like all the clippings from all of her early speeches. So this is, how I was able to write her biography. And so those early speeches advocated socialism, they critiqued women's oppression under capitalism. Her talks often centered on working class women's low wages. She talked about their lack of birth control and their double day of wage work and housework. And this was kind of the era, the early 1900s was sort of the era of soapbox speakers. They were a feature of city life. And you have to remember, this was prior to the invention of the radio. And people who had a message to get across just climbed up on a soapbox and held forth. And so you had a lot of people out speaking on soapboxes in the early 1900s. Flynn worked for her political goals through two major organizations. And I just put that up on this first slide here. The first one was the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the IWW, which is the acronym, or the Wobblies, from 1907 to 1916, and the Communist Party from 1937 until her death in 1964. So both of these groups advocated socialism, but they envisioned it quite differently. The Wobblies, or the IWW, they were essentially anti-statist. They envisioned workers' cooperatives as the basis of a new society, and they advocated direct action rather than participation in the political process. In contrast, the communists were very pro-state. They looked to the Soviet Russia as a model, and then the Soviet Union as examples of a socialist society. So despite these significant organizational differences, Flynn was one of many people who actually began their political lives in the IWW and then continued on to join the Communist Party. In some cases, when it started shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, or in Flynn's case in the 1930s. So Flynn described these two phases of her activism as her first life and her second life. And because Kaylee invited me to help contextualize the story that is told in Jess Walter's book, The Cold Millions, I am going to focus more on Flynn's first life. So as I mentioned, she joined the IWW in 1907. Despite being a star student and a champion debater at her Bronx public school, she dropped out of high school to go on the road as an agitator for the IWW. That was what the IWW called their speakers. They called them agitators or jaw smiths. And I think you can get a little bit of a sense of the impression she made from this photograph. And this was in her early years as a Wobbly. So as an agitator, Flynn became famous for leading free speech fights in the Pacific Northwest in 1909 and 1910. And for leading two major strikes of textile workers in the East, the first in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, and the second in Paterson, New Jersey in 1913. And in between those two major strikes, she also was active in a strike of culinary workers in New York City. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of those conflicts. And again, Flynn led such an active life that there's a lot of other examples I could use. And if you want more details, I'm happy to tell you more in the Q&A. So Flynn's youth, beauty, and radical message brought attention wherever she traveled. And while she was out on the road, she met and fell in love with Jack Jones, a former miner and an IWW organizer. And Flynn's friend, Vincent St. John, who was the first head of the IWW, remarked, Elizabeth fell in love with the West and the miners, and she married the first one she met. So I guess that was his way of saying, perhaps they were not a match that was destined to endure. At the time, Flynn began leading the free speech fights in Missoula and Spokane. She was in the early months of her pregnancy with her son, Fred. And the first fight in Missoula started in September of 1909. And at that point, basically, it was the strategy, this sort of developed as a strategy of the IWW to recruit members. They would kind of go into town, set up a soapbox. Sometimes they would criticize the employment agents who were taking advantage of the workers, charging high fees and maybe not giving them jobs. And so they would stand up and they would just have these open air meetings. They had pretty radical beliefs. They were trying to organize out in the Pacific Northwest. They were focused on people, say, who were working in logging, transient men. And needless to say, the authorities found this rather threatening. They didn't appreciate all of these guys kind of getting up and holding these open air meetings and calling for revolution. And in most towns and cities at that point, there were you needed a permit to speak. And so they were challenging that principle. And they led about 25 free speech fights, the IWW did. The first one was in Missoula. In October, Flynn was arrested for speaking without a permit, but she was quickly released. And in part, this particular fight lasted for a couple of months, and then the city kind of relented. But things were a little bit more, I would say the violence was a little bit worse in Spokane. And so even in Missoula, the IWW used this strategy of mass arrest as a means of civil disobedience. And at this point in her life, Flynn basically says well, I was young and beautiful. And so if I got arrested, they never held me for very long. But that was not the case with a lot of the men that she was working with, and a lot of Wobblies who got arrested contended with a tremendous amount of violence. And so the next free speech fight that broke out was in Spokane, Washington, in December of 1909. And at that point, Flynn was visibly pregnant when she arrived in Spokane. And the men that were kind of organizing were not very happy to have her show up pregnant. They didn't like the idea of sort of a pregnant woman kind of appearing in public. Flynn thought it was fine, but she tried to be, respectful of their wishes. And so she agreed that she would only speak inside the IWW hall, which she said was basically on Skid Row. And then she became editor of the newspaper, and she did some traveling to try to kind of support the cause. But despite trying to keep a low profile, she and 6 other leaders were arrested on conspiracy charges. And here's how I describe her experience of being arrested and held in prison for a night in my book. On a cold winter morning in 1909, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn woke up in a Spokane, Washington jail cell to the unwelcome feeling of a strange man's hand on her cheek. She sat up and told him she was not there to be insulted. He backed off, leaving Flynn her breakfast, weak coffee and stale bread. She had spent the night in jail after being arrested on conspiracy charges. Pregnant, she had been thrown into the single women's cell with 2 prostitutes. Flynn's cellmates had tried to make her comfortable, sharing some food and lending her a pillow. Having been arrested several times before, Flynn was relieved that she was not alone, at the mercy, and this is a quote from her, at the mercy of men you do not trust a moment, day or night, unable to defend yourself or call for help. Despite the company the women offered, the heavy door to the jail cell had opened and closed all night as the jailers brought the women downstairs to visit sweethearts. Flynn found the women and the jailers to be on terms of disgusting familiarity, and that's a quote. Later that day, Flynn was out on bail. Awaiting trial, she reflected, this all in the name of law and order. O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name? And so that was one of her many arrests that took place in Spokane. In this case, she was pregnant. She wrote a story about it that got picked up by a lot of newspapers. And I think she was pretty good at using that experience actually to help generate positive publicity for the strike. So the charges against Flynn were ultimately dropped, and the city agreed to let people speak freely without a permit after a few months of conflict, so long as the Wobblies stopped calling in outside agitators. And I think I have another couple of slides. This is a clipping from a newspaper that was published in Missoula, Montana. And I think it's interesting, the headline says, woman is orator for the IWW. That was newsworthy at the time. And here is an image of her around the same time. Some of these pictures are a little difficult to date. And one of the things that was kind of that's fun is that every time I talk about her, I find like another photo or something, because more stuff is always being digitized. So that's exciting. So when the free speech battle ended in Spokane, her husband, Jack Jones, expected her to move with him to Butte, Montana, so that he could resume his work as a miner and she could settle into life as a wife and mother. But she had no interest in this plan. As she later recalled, I wanted to speak and write, to travel, to meet people, to see places, to organize for the IWW. I saw no reason why I, as a woman, should give up my work for his. So Flynn left her husband and went back to her family in New York City, where she gave birth to her son, Fred. And this is, I think, a lovely picture of her and Fred. So part of the reason that she was able to make this choice is that she had the support of her family. And this is a picture, you can see Flynn there on the left, her sister Kathy in the middle, and her mother Annie on the right. And I love this picture because there's very few family portraits, and it's kind of lovely to have this one. This was taken when Fred was about 6 months old, and they were visiting Caritas Island, which was this kind of private retreat that was owned by the Stokes family. And she was friends with Rose Pastor Stokes. So Flynn's experiences being a mother, I would say, informed her activism and helped her understand some of the particular challenges that women faced as wage workers. And one of the places where we can see this is in the famous Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which lasted from January to March of 1912. The Lawrence strike began when workers discovered that their wages had been cut in proportion to a new state labor law that reduced women's working hours from 56 to 54 a week. 25,000 men, women, and children participated in a 2-month strike. And I should add, this was in the woolen industry. And the strike included workers of more than 25 different nationalities. And one of the things, just one of the many things that is so interesting about researching this period is just to see how phenomenally diverse the working class was at this point. Women made up a majority of the strikers, and Flynn held special meetings for women. And in those meetings, she honed in on the challenges that they faced as wage earners and as mothers. And this included having to work right up until the time they gave birth, because they didn't have any maternity leave, certainly, living in crowded and expensive housing, and not being able to afford any of the fine cloth, the wool cloth that they produced. In some cases, not even being able to afford coats for themselves or their children. And one of the things that Flynn did during that strike is she managed something called the Children's Crusade. And this is a picture of it. And you can see Flynn there kind of in the center. And this was a strategy of sending strikers' children out of Lawrence to cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Barre, Vermont, so that women could participate actively in the strike and that the children could be better fed and cared for. And so I just thought this was, this is, I think, really, really interesting in that Flynn knew that she wasn't going to get the women's participation unless their children were taken care of. And so by sending the children out, she protected the children, but also she freed the mothers to participate in the strike. And this is a picture of a parade that was held of some of these children after they arrived in New York City on the train, and they were parading down Fifth Avenue before meeting families that had been selected to take them in. This generated a lot of support for the strike. And it built support for the strikers. It helped with fundraising. And the strikers did succeed. They rolled back the wage cut, gaining increases of 5 to 25% in their wages, and perhaps equally as important, claiming a right to be treated with dignity. And again, this is a theme that I see in a lot of 20th century labor conflicts. It's not just about wages, it's also about workers wanting dignity. Lawrence also became the location where Flynn met Carlo Tresca, who would become her romantic partner until 1925. He was an Italian anarchist. And there were a lot of Italian workers in Lawrence. And so he was there to organize them. And so organizing at that point was a very multilingual affair. And the IWW sought to send organizers that could speak the language of the workers, which of course made sense. In May of 1912 and 1913, basically after the Lawrence strike was over, Flynn and Tresca worked together on a strike of waiters and culinary workers in New York City. And I thought this was interesting because the IWW was active in organizing workers that were not always covered by unions that were run by the American Federation of Labor. And so organizing women, organizing immigrants, organizing food service workers, this was very typical of the IWW. Some of their goals in the conflict, workers were asking for an end to tipping in favor of higher weekly wages, as well as an 8-hour day. And I think this is Flynn around that time. And she was just, everyone sort of remarked on what a magnetic speaker she was. And I think this is an interesting clipping. Miss Flynn, the real power behind the men, Carrie's anti-tip proposal. And again, I think this theme, they talk about wrangling in 4 languages, but organizing, figuring out how to organize a diverse group of workers. And this particular strike did not actually end up being successful. The culinary workers did organize, but not at this particular moment. Flynn's next big act was to be a leader of the Paterson strike, the strike in Paterson, New Jersey, of silk workers that lasted from February to July of 1913. And here the issue that set off the strike was an increase in the number of looms that workers were asked to tend from 2 to 4. And I think these pictures are kind of amazing. I think especially this one of Flynn up on the platform, and you can see everyone looks like they're just kind of leaning forward to hear what she has to say. And so she was just this, incredibly magnetic orator who was really able to talk to people, I think, because she spent time among them, learning what their concerns were and figuring out what the IWW could do to help them. But the IWW had a hard time in Paterson than they did even in Lawrence. And in Lawrence, I wouldn't say that the police certainly were not friendly to the strikers in Lawrence, but in Paterson, they prosecuted them more aggressively. So in Lawrence, you had a lot of instances of the police kind of coming at workers with bayonets. In Paterson, you had more strikers and strike leaders getting arrested, and then the organization having to figure out how to bail people out. So in Paterson, Flynn was charged with inciting violence and prevented from speaking. So she was basically barred from Paterson. And so this also, in a sense, became a free speech fight. And Flynn made a lot of connections with radicals and liberals in Greenwich Village who were also interested in free speech ideas. Paterson was also a tougher battle because it had smaller companies, and so it made it more difficult to come to a settlement. One of the interesting things, and I think, the things that people kind of remember about the Paterson strike is the pageant of the Paterson strike. And this is a flyer from it performed by the strikers themselves at Madison Square Garden on June 7th. And this is an example of some of those Greenwich Village radicals trying to figure out how to support the strike. The journalist Jack Reed staged this huge pageant at Madison Square Garden, and he featured actual strikers as well as leaders like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. So they came and they kind of reenacted key moments from the strike. So artistically, this was a success, but as a strike leader, Flynn ended up feeling that it was kind of counterproductive. So the strike collapsed in July when skilled workers settled with their employers, and Flynn was kind of crushed by this defeat. Here is an image of Flynn around 1915. This is at the high point of her work with the IWW. Joe Hill wrote the song "The Rebel Girl" for Flynn after she visited him in jail in Salt Lake City, where he was charged with murder and shaking evidence. She had launched a campaign to try to secure his freedom, even managing to get a meeting with President Woodrow Wilson, but she was not successful. Hill was executed shortly after he wrote the song. making him one of many martyrs to the radical cause of one big union. And the one big union, that was the motto of the IWW. Now, in the long run, I think that far more violence was directed against members of the IWW than was perpetrated by them. And this violence came from many sources. It came from employers, the police, vigilantes, state militia. But the most destructive violence by far came from the federal government. And although I had some general knowledge of the Red Scare before I began researching this book, I have to say I was pretty shocked to read about how it unfolded kind of at firsthand through Flynn's papers. In September of 1917, Flynn was one of 168 leaders of the IWW who were indicted by the federal government for seditious conspiracy. And this, of course, is after the United States had entered World War I, a crime that ranked next to treason. And at this point, when America entered the war, membership in the IWW had surged from about 40,000 to 100,000, with many new members, especially in the West, in war industries. And so this was seen as a threat to the war effort. Flynn managed to get her case severed from the group indictment, but approximately 1,500 radicals were imprisoned for the duration of the war, and thousands of foreign-born workers were detained. Most were eventually released, but hundreds were deported. And one of the things that I didn't know about until I researched this book was the fact that Ellis Island, which we think of as kind of, the gateway of immigration to the United States, it was actually turned into a prison and used as kind of a place for holding people before they were deported. And so it's at this point, Flynn establishes the Workers' Defense Union, and that group becomes part of the American Civil Liberties Union, which of course, again, ties back into this theme of free speech. So having managed to escape prison herself, Flynn worked day and night to free people who had been convicted on charges related to activities or affiliations judged threatening to national security. Their crimes ranged from refusing to enroll in the military, to leading strikes, to belonging to the IWW, or participating in organizations that supported the Bolshevik Revolution. So in a sense, I would say the Red Scare marked the end of Flynn's first life. It basically destroyed the IWW, and it sent Flynn, along with some personal issues, kind of sent her into a deep depression for 10 years from 1926 to 1937. This is a picture of her during that period of time. And she would emerge in 1937, after a decade in Oregon, to become a leader of the American Communist Party, an organization which I would say had many problematic elements, but she remained loyal to until her death in Moscow in 1964. And if anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to address them during the Q&A. But I think that can kind of wrap up my formal presentation. Yeah, maybe I'll turn it over to you guys and see if there's any questions I can answer.
I have a question. It seems that, and I know nothing about this person, but she was able to travel across the country at a time when 1907 and 1909 the country was tinkering on a bank failure, and then again she went into a depression during 1926, at the time of the depression in this country. But how did she get money to be so active in the cause?
That is a great question. How did she get money to be so active in the cause? So basically, she was hired by the IWW as an organizer. Like, they could see that she was a very effective public speaker. And as she traveled, when she spoke, she would actually sell like buttons and literature, pamphlets, like stuff like that. All of that helped support the IWW. And then when people joined the IWW, they would pay dues, although the IWW was kind of notoriously bad at actually collecting dues from its members. But some of that would go into paying her salary. So she was definitely the most prominent woman within the IWW. So like, of those 168 leaders who were arrested, Flynn was the only woman. And so you can think of her, as being paid sort of the way a union organizer would be paid now. But she would also work at the time, to do whatever she could to raise money by selling literature and stuff like that. And when she traveled, she always took the train. So she's got great, when you look back at her diary, great accounts of kind of taking the train. The first time she traveled, she went to Chicago for an IWW meeting, and she says like, oh, I didn't really realize how far Chicago was, but I didn't have enough money to get a sleeper car, so she's going to Chicago, sitting up the whole time, basically. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. And then the other thing is that she really liked is that workers, wherever she traveled, like IWW members would take her into their homes. And so it wasn't like she was going and like staying at a hotel or anything like that. It was like she was staying with workers in their homes. And she thought that was like really important part of her job as well, because it gave her an opportunity to really get to know people and to understand like firsthand what the struggles were that they were coping with.
So then she also left her husband, which at that time was almost a very big step to take, because divorce was not recognized, and she had to go back and live with her family in the Bronx, and that couldn't have been very prosperous for her. So
and she really became a supporter for her family. I mean, I think like maybe as I suggested, like her father often had unsteady work. And when she began her kind of career as like, being a public speaker essentially and being a radical speaker, she pretty quickly gained notoriety. And so the money, she talks about the first time she went out on the road for the IWW, I think she went out and worked for 2 weeks, and she was shocked actually when they paid her. She got $36 and the family owed $20 in rent. So it was like the first $20 went to pay the rent, which was like very overdue. And so that was part of her, I think, returning to her family and her mother and her sister taking care of her son. Is she was also, really a supporter for her family. And so they all kind of like pooled their resources together. But yeah, in terms of the marriage, when I went back and kind of like looked at it and like did a little math on the dates, it seemed to me that the pregnancy had probably preceded the marriage, actually. But I think that she got married to Jack. I think she got married to Jack Jones because she was pregnant, and because I don't know, her family would not have been okay with her being like an unmarried mother. But they seem to accept her being a divorced mother. That was okay. But I think unmarried was kind of a bridge too far at the time.
Kind of unusual for an Irish,
maybe
Catholic family
well,
to accept divorce.
They were her mother, they were Irish, but they were not Catholic. They were very strongly like atheistic, and her mother especially was like a proud atheist. So yeah, they were an unconventional family for sure. And it was interesting to me to see how, and they themselves had been involved in radical social movements in the late 19th century. They were both part of this group called the Knights of Labor, which in certain ways I think was a predecessor to the IWW. They tried to organize all producers. So they had been active in the labor movement too, and they were they definitely like had their standards of respectability, but they were radical in terms of their socialism. Any other questions?
I don't have a question. What I want to say is thank you.
Oh,
My
thank you.
My name is Iyabo Onipede. My first name is Elizabeth. I'm named after my great aunt, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn.
Oh.
I bet you're shocked that I'm
Stop.
here.
Really?
So
Oh my
you
goodness.
talk about how funny this Irish family was. Well, my father was a Nigerian at Columbia University studying political philosophy. In the late 40s, he was one of the first Nigerians to come to the United States. And he would go to all these underground political meetings in Greenwich Village, right there. And she fell in love with him and introduced him to my mother, Frances, who is her sister's daughter.
Oh my goodness. Wow. I have like read about you. And Frances, yes. Oh my goodness. Wow.
And so my mother was Frances. My grandmother was Annie. Annie was a New York public school teacher. And after Aunt Elizabeth introduced them, you want to talk about a really different kind of family. My mother married my father, went to Nigeria, lived there for 36 years. And when my father died, they had been married for 50 years. My grandmother had come to Nigeria to visit for like 6 weeks. And she stayed 2 years. And every time she renewed her visa, she would say, I love being here. I love the Nigerian people.
That's so interesting. Wow.
So the weirdest thing is today I do a lot of anti-racism training. And, I had to work through being biracial. I've lived here 40 years. And I had to work through being biracial and what does that mean in the face of racism in this country. And it's just like, I'm like, well, she wasn't your regular white person. My mother wasn't.
Definitely not. Definitely not. That's a good summary of it. Yeah.
And so
no, they were very unconventional. I think that's true.
And I want to say thank you because the older I get and the more I do my work, my parents are both gone. My name Iyabo in Yoruba language means grandmother has returned.
Oh.
And Aunt Elizabeth was considered my mother's mother as well as her. She was raised by both Kathy and Elizabeth. And so she felt both were her mothers.
Right.
I was born in 65. Aunt Elizabeth died in 64 and her mother died even earlier. So my name means these women have come back to the family.
Right.
Like
right.
believe in that kind of reincarnation. So my mother's living relative out in California, she's 91. I was like, Aunt Roberta, can't you come on this call?
Yes, I've been in touch with her. Yeah, she's amazing. I've spoken with her on the phone. Yeah. Yeah, what a cool woman. I mean, she's also what a cool family.
I can't keep up with them. They're like so spectacular. I'm like, oh, I feel so ordinary next to you guys.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for coming. It's like what an unexpected gift to get the chance to meet you virtually.
Yes, thank you so much.
And literally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where are you calling in from, if you don't mind me asking?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Ah.
I have a Google alert on her name, and this came up, and I told the whole family, everybody has stuff going on this evening. And you can always reach out. I'm very
Yeah,
excited.
I will
I
definitely.
just really, it's so meaningful to me that people are researching, especially in the age of today's activism. There's a lot to pull on. Like, one of my fantasies is to meet Angela Davis one day, because when she went to Alderson, she writes about how she read Elizabeth's leftover books.
Oh, that's so
Book,
cool. That's
yeah,
so
she
cool. I
writes
never heard
about.
that. I never heard that.
It's in I think Women, Class, and Gender by Angela Davis.
Okay. And one of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's best friends at Alderson was Claudia Jones, who was a Black activist who was deported. She was, and ended up dying in England. But she was a close friend of Claudia Jones's, and I think that was sort of part of how she made it through her time at Alderson, was being there with Claudia Jones. But I hadn't heard that about Angela Davis then, reading those books. That's very cool.
Yeah. But I'm just grateful. I reached out to Jess Walters, and I've talked with him, and I've been on a Zoom like this with him, and I loved the book. Because I didn't get to know her, and I only knew her through stories of my parents.
Right.
The animation he brings to it, the conversation, the pieces just enlivened her even more for me.
Right. And I mean, that's something I think that fiction, is able to do sometimes even more than history, historical fiction. Yeah, I have a few historian friends, and we fantasize sometimes about, we're like, maybe we should just stop writing history and like write some novels.
I think writing novels is a little more difficult when you have to come up with all the dialogue. You really need a good imagination.
Yeah.
I'm also grateful for those that showed up on the call to hear about this. And, for me, my hope is to connect with her work in a way that envisions the kind of community building we want to see in social activism, and to just build communities where people are treated fairly and seen as fully human. I enjoy living in a capitalist society. I mean, I wouldn't have come here if I didn't. There are things I do enjoy about it, but that the extremes are really problematic.
Yeah. And just that theme of dignity, I think, that everybody deserves a livelihood and everybody deserves to be treated with respect. That was something that was so important to her and important to the Wobblies, and kind of, I would say, lifting up some of the people who had been forgotten, or people, who were kind of crushed by the system, just recognizing that wasn't right. And the idea that there should be a better way of organizing society. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.